have closed captioning at that point, but we're having difficulties right now. Anyway, welcome. My name is Joan Wilshire. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota State Council on Disability, and on behalf of the Council, I would like to thank you all for coming out on this snowy day. We've got a few folks here in St. Paul and 4 other locations, and of course, a web stream. So we thank everybody for trying to be a part of this interesting conversation today on voting rights in Minnesota. Minnesota is really one of the more aggressive states on voting, and MSCOD always wants to be a part of some of these big, hot issues. The Council on Disability is a small state agency. We're actually celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, and we exist to be able to advise the governor, state legislature, state agencies, and the public regarding disability issues, and voting and elections certainly is one of the key topics that we want to advise them on. Now, as we're talking about voting, you know, to be able to vote is to be empowered as an individual in general, with or without a disability. To be able to vote is to have a voice in our democratic process. But for people with disabilities, the right to vote has often been overlooked. As a group, we're often very invisible, and that's an invisible of around 20% of our population here in Minnesota has a disability. So that's pretty significant. So today we're here to learn more about what other states are doing to increase voting participation for people with disabilities, also looking at what seniors are doing, what progress directions Minnesotans are moving in to increase voter participation for these groups, and then looking at the national voting issues as well for people with disabilities. We're really pleased today to have 3 experts here on our panel here to talk about these issues, and we also have a little further in our panel here today. We have another panel which will have an election judge, somebody representing seniors, and a person with a disability, and to speak about their past voting experiences in this last election. So why don't we get started here with our first speaker, Jeff Narabrook of the Minnesota Participation Project, and he's going to update us on the state's approach to voting. And he's with the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits since about, 2009. And Jeff provides leadership to the Minnesota Participation Project, the MCN's program that builds capacity among nonprofit organizations for engaging their constituencies and communities in civic participation. He led MCN's 2009 and 10 outreach and educational efforts on the 2010 census and participated in MCN's work on redistricting and election reform efforts. So welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I work in the area of civic engagement, partnering with nonprofit organizations. We've done a lot of different activities throughout the years, including rides to the polls, training people on voter registration, techniques for getting people motivated and out to the polls, and so forth. So part of our work is looking at our current system and our voting laws and improving it, and part of that, for me, is understanding what's going on nationally. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of voting law trends nationally. I also say our perspective as we approach voting laws is one where we believe people should have easy and available access to voting. So we do not see, as you all know, there's a big debate going on nationally about things like voter fraud. My bias, I guess you could say, just to be clear from the start, is we don't see voter fraud as being an issue that would sufficient enough to, say, create restrictive voting laws and a lot of other things that we've seen pop up. In fact, even though Minnesota leads the nation in voter turnout, which you probably know, there's still a lot of Minnesotans who don't vote. In 2010, there were 1.6 million eligible Minnesotans who didn't vote. And to give you a sense of how many people that is, if you took every single resident living in the top 16 most populous Minnesota cities, that's 1.6 million people. So even though we do lead the country, there's still a lot of growth in terms of voter turnout, and we're really proud of what we do here, but there's always more work to be done to engage people. As we talk about kind of a national overview of voting, I want to ground us in an idea that we probably all know, but the ramifications which may not be so obvious at first, which is states set their own voting laws. So I think you all have a sense that different states have different rules, but it may not be clear exactly how much latitude each state has. So we as Minnesota can set our own eligibility guidelines. We could have 16-year-olds voting if we wanted. We could have non-citizens voting in state elections. In Maine, for example, if you're incarcerated, you can still vote. You never lose your voting right if you've had a felony status. In Florida, if you've had a felony, you can essentially never vote again. North Dakota doesn't have a voter registration system like all the other states. Voting equipment varies from everywhere. Some places use electronic equipment. Some places like Minnesota use paper ballots. Rules for registration vary. Some places you need to prove your citizenship now in order to register. Some places have poll watchers and challengers, and everything varies by state. There are, of course, some federal guidelines and some that directly impact voters who have a disability that were passed in the Help America Vote Act in response to the lack of poll accessibility kind of universally. That's, as I understand it, there's been a great improvement there. But I just wanted to make it clear that voters in every state can have very, very, very different experiences. We're only a handful of states that have election day registration. So in other states, if you don't register by that deadline, you're out of luck. Some places have early voting, which we'll talk a little bit about. So you get the point. There's a lot of different options out there for states to set their own rules. The opportunity, of course, is that in a place like Minnesota, we can set our own course and hopefully have and do have a really great system. But that means that even though we're one country, there's really different rules that apply to voters all over the country. And I think that poses some serious questions, in terms of what it's like to be in the same democracy. So I'll talk a little bit about both some positive and negative trends that we've seen nationally, and maybe start with the negative to get it out of the way. Ever since the 2000 contentious election, we've seen a rise in attention to voting laws as a matter of public policy. And in particular, in the last 2 to 3 years, this has really gotten a lot larger. I think this has been a discussion that's been going on outside of the public eye for many years, and now it's really a pretty public discussion. And I know that's probably why we're having this forum today, because voting rights is kind of in the news quite a lot. So a couple of laws that we see as posing some restrictions on people's freedom and right to vote. Of course, you're all familiar with the voter ID and photo ID debates. I'll note those are two different things. Photo ID means you have to have a photo in order to vote. There are many other types of IDs. There are 4 states that require a photo ID to vote, which means you can't cast a standard ballot unless you have a specific type of photo ID. 4 other states have passed that law, but they have been challenged and are not challenged in the courts and are currently under judicial review. Other states have a variety of non-photo ID laws. Some states say ask for a photo ID, like Michigan, but it's not required in order to vote. You can sign an affidavit in lieu of that, and a whole range of other things that may or may not be required in order to vote. But the point is, there's been a trend in creating more stringent rules that would probably, and we know would, impact people's ability to participate. Another category is proof of citizenship. So this, for instance, would be that in order to register to vote, you have to show a birth certificate. There are a number of states now that have this as a law. It's actually before the Supreme Court this week, where they're challenging that law as it's been placed in Arizona. And I don't have the number, but I think Georgia, Kansas, Arizona, and maybe 1 or 2 others have a law now where in order to register to vote, you need to show proof of citizenship. We've also seen attempts to make kind of voter registration drives harder. I think this is something certainly of concern to nonprofits, where the League of Women Voters out there doing great registration work in the community. These are laws that would make it harder for the kind of third-party nonprofits like the League or a disability-serving organization to conduct voter registration activities. So I'm not familiar on the details of how the restrictions are set up, but essentially they require you to register. They place limits on your activities. You have to become like a deputy registrar with the state. Colorado has a system like that. Florida does as well. Fortunately, we haven't seen that happen in Minnesota. So right now in Minnesota, anybody can really help anybody else register to vote, and we think that is how it should be. Of course, people should know the law when they're doing this, so they're not getting anybody in trouble. But we would be troubled by laws that kind of are intended to limit the ability of other groups to register. So it's happening in other places, not here. We also saw a reduction in early voting and absentee voting days in a number of states where they have that law. We don't have early voting here. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we saw some very last minute, you probably saw before the election in 2012, court challenges and all sorts of things in trying to limit the number of days that people could vote early. How those played out in different locales varied. And some, I think in Ohio actually, it was different counties had different rules, even down to that level. We've also seen, this is the last negative restrictive thing, then I'll go to some positive things, an attempt to make it harder to restore the right to vote for people who've had a felony conviction. So, as I said, each state has different rules about that. Some you can't ever vote again. Some you never have your vote taken away, and in the majority, it's can be your right to vote would be restored at some point after you've completed your probation or parole. And we've seen in some states where they had a more, say, generous law in that area, roll it back and make it more difficult. So like one state said where you could vote under probation previously, now you can't. So those are the different categories that we've seen on voting restrictions. I won't talk about Minnesota because I know we're going to get to Minnesota later, but I'm sure you're all aware of the large discussion we had last fall on the voter ID issue and the conclusion it had where the voters rejected writing that law into our Constitution. But I think Minnesota has had its share of and continues to have a share of people pushing to restrict voting, but we've, I think, fortunately not seen some of these other policies really have a lot of life here. As far as positive directions, so same-day registration, as I mentioned, only a small number of states, about 10 now, have it, and we're actually seeing that expanded. So California and Connecticut picked that up in 2011 or 12. It's not yet implemented, but they will soon. Online registration, where you can register to vote online, is spreading. So whole number of states added that within the past couple of years, and I know we're hoping to see that here in Minnesota. Another category is voter registration modernization. So actually, I think prior to the Help America Vote Act, states weren't even required to have an electronic statewide voter registration system. Since that time, states, and largely, by way of context, I think most states, the counties are running the elections, and so gathering that data is not an easy thing. You have lots of levels of government that are actually running the election, and when you try to coordinate that on the state level, it takes a lot of infrastructure and technology. But we're hoping to see some, and we are seeing nationally some calls for voter registration modernization. That would mean, for instance, anytime, say, you interface with a government agency, you have the option to register to vote, not just when you're at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Registration could become portable, so that anytime you move, you're automatically registered to vote, and you don't have to re-register each time you move addresses. That would be a great change that the technology does exist for. Creating fail-safe procedures to ensure that eligible voters who are not on the rolls can correct the information online or at the polls. So there's a variety of things we can do to make the registration system stronger, more comprehensive, kind of talk more to other systems. There's been a growing interest in technology in voting. I don't know that I have a point of view on some of these items, and I think some of them have a lot of questions. So, for instance, voting online, I think, is a long ways away from being a safe and secure thing, but there's a number of states that are looking at that either as a backup plan or just doing some pilot projects. Electronic poll books, something that we're looking at here in Minnesota, where the registration system could be downloaded electronically instead of having a paper roster, and there could be some advantages to that. And then also, at least 2 states, I don't know when these were implemented, but we're seeing just a general interest in early and so-called convenience voting, including the states of Washington and Oregon, which they actually have an all-mail voting system. That's MAIL, where they don't have polling places. Nobody on election day. There's not a bunch of polling places open. People are sent ballots in the mail. They send them back, and that's the way that people vote there. And I think there's an option to go in person, but essentially they don't operate the way any other state does on election day. I haven't seen a lot of other states looking to that, but seems to work well for them so far. So that's a lot of stuff. There's a lot going on nationally, both good and bad, and we've been working here on the state level to look at things like absentee voting, early voting, online registration, restoring the right to vote for people who've had a felony. One thing we'd like to see, for instance, is to have that. Right now in Minnesota, it's when you're off probation or parole. We think there's not really a criminal justice reason to restrict that vote after they've already served their time in prison, that when they're back in the community and expected to be participating, that voting is something, too, that should be available, and that we'd actually want and expect that of people who are looking to, kind of do good. So I don't know if people have any questions.
Jeff, I think we're going to hold questions until we get done with Secretary of State Mark Ritchie here, and then we'll hopefully have some questions. I'm going to introduce our next guest here. Our Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, is here with us today, and he's going to really talk about some of the Minnesota voting landscape and give us kind of another good view of what's been happening here. But let me give you a little background of our Secretary of State. Minnesota's Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, partners with townships, cities, and county officials to organize elections on behalf of Minnesotans, 3.7 million eligible voters. Ritchie also oversees a wide range of services for Minnesota businesses provided by the Office of Secretary of State. He's also responsible for administering Safe at Home and Minnesota's Address Confidential programs. Secretary Ritchie has been a faculty member for election law seminars conducted by the Minnesota Institute for Legal Education, the Minnesota and Hennepin County Bar Association, the University of Minnesota, and William and Mary Law School, too. And finally, the 2011 Dwight David Eisenhower Excellence in Public Service Award was presented to Secretary Ritchie. This award recognizes the promotion of peace through mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation, one individual at a time, one community at a time. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity, and it's great to see you here. I want to talk about our local situation by backing up to last year, because last year had a lot of exciting things that occurred, and some of them were so exciting they weren't even noticed because we were in the middle of some other things. But I want to cite 2 very important legal cases that occurred last year, lawsuits and opinions by judges. The first was the challenge to our Election Day registration system. Yes, it was challenged on the ballot. It was in a constitutional amendment change proposed, and the citizens pretty strongly rejected that. But I think more importantly, in the course of the year, it was challenged in federal court. And this suit that's actually still under appeal and kind of goes on forever, it feels like it goes on forever, came in front of Judge Donovan Frank. And this case argued that our system was unconstitutional, and there were actually very excellent presentations on both sides. Excellent paper was filed. Lawsuits are a lot of paper. The argument was essentially this, that on the one hand, the argument was we have a right to vote, and nobody can take away that right to vote if we're 18, a citizen, and all of that, except for a judge. The other argument was no, we don't really have a right to vote. We have a privilege to vote, and then we have to jump over this hoop, this hoop, this hoop, however high those hoops are according to the government. And if we jump over those hoops, then we have a right to vote. Privilege to vote is ours. The judge very, very strongly came down on the side of saying that we have a right to vote, and only a judge can take away that right. And it was a very dramatic ruling, worth reading, kind of short actually. but Donovan Frank wrote it with a lot of thought in how to describe our system. It's an excellent little guide to our system and how that system is consistent with the Minnesota Constitution and the federal Constitution, because as was pointed out earlier, much of our election law is based at the state level, so you have to keep in mind the state constitution and the federal Constitution in these matters. The second was a very unusual case in which a young man who was in guardianship, I believe because of injuries received in the Iraq War, but in any case, Judge Quam in Hennepin County, who's a senior judge of our probate court, wrote a very long, very detailed opinion about why the Minnesota constitutional provision denying the right to vote to citizens in guardianship was unconstitutional in relationship to the U.S. government's constitution. And while, you know, what was said earlier about states have the right to set laws really kind of independently, they cannot set laws, nor can they have constitutional provisions in violation of the U.S. Constitution, which is overriding. And that includes laws on federal elections must be consistent and so on and so forth. But in this case, Judge Quam's ruling has not been challenged by anybody. It is a fantastic piece of writing about what are our rights as people. And it, in a way, is perhaps one of the most significant federal rulings, judicial rulings in the country in a very long time, and of course has a lot of other implications about our own state laws. So anyhow, those two created a kind of backdrop of judicial ruling on the question of the right to vote in Minnesota. Both came down very hard, very solidly on the right to vote. And both stated that that right could not be taken away by just somebody passing something in the Constitution or just by, somebody passing a law here or there. It could only be taken away by a judge in a proceeding. And so those were pretty important. We did have a big vote on the constitutional measure, which related to Election Day registration, and the citizens said pretty loud and clear they like Election Day registration. It isn't so surprising. 61% of Minnesotans have used Election Day registration. Election Day registration was on the ballot in Maine about a year before us, and again there it was strongly defended by its citizens, about a 60-some% vote to retain Election Day registration. So, I know people express a lot of amazement or whatever at the outcome of the elections, but in fact it's kind of consistent with what we know from other states and from our own experience here. But there were also other elements of last year that I think have been important in terms of getting momentum around some election law change. We've been stuck a little bit in terms of election law change for the past 6 or 8 years. Split legislature, governor's office, that kind of thing. But in the two big recounts, there were elements that we discovered by putting a kind of electron microscope on our system that gave momentum to make changes of things that we've known for a long time needed to be changed, but we didn't have the political will or momentum to do it. I'll just give you one example. Many years ago, we had quite a little ruckus when candidate for governor John Grunseth was thrown off the ballot very late in the process, about a week out. We also had the tragic death of Senator Wellstone about a week out from an election. Both of those things have been in the minds of many lawmakers whenever it's been brought up that our system that we formerly had for processing absentee ballots might not be the best system. We were processing absentee ballots in 4,000 local polling places late at night. Many of you have been election judges, you know what I mean. And it was primarily, people would argue when we would say that's crazy, they would say, oh, but what if something happened, And of course, something happens every single day of the life, and so it's a kind of a hard argument to argue against. But because of the recount in the 08 race, the second recount in 08, not the one for Justice Gilday, but the one in the Senate race, we had the momentum. People said we have to change the system, and we were able to make change. But mostly, we've been stuck. Now, last year we had some significant developments because we had the largest turnout we've ever had in state history from a numeric point of view, and we also had a slight decrease in those voting by mail absentee, and so we had more people physically coming through our doors. I think about 55,000, something in that range, going through the doors. And as a result of that, plus the sort of redistricting, the little chaos that you get from the first time around your first time after redistricting, we had long lines in some places, and we also had just a lot of kind of energy around making elections just as voter-friendly as possible. For one thing, we age, we get busier. These things occur. And in the case of last year's elections, there were places where people voted after midnight, which means a 4-hour wait. So, there's a new climate, there's a new possibility, there's a very strong sort of reaction from the vote that took place where the citizens affirmed their support for our election system and the two, actually there were more, but the two important judicial orders. But there also was a national perception, I think very fair to say, that we all now live in a national news bubble. And so when other states are attempting to reduce early voting or attempting to restrict voting in some ways or whatever it might be, we hear those things. So we come to the legislature this year, people want to deal with some of the issues, and there's momentum to make some change. For example, it was mentioned earlier that a couple states have gone to all vote by mail. There's a whole group of states who've proposed that, but there's almost entire western United States is somewhere between 50 and 75% vote by mail, including there are those that are 100%. But Nevada, 70% of the people vote before Election Day. They don't have lines on Election Day. And so last year, when the question of lines on Election Day not only was an issue in Minnesota, there actually were lines apparently in Wyoming, which caught me by surprise, but there were big lines in some other big states. The question of vote by mail became a kind of early stand-in for addressing the question of long lines, as did the question of early voting, which we don't officially or legally have, but we often will get mailings from the various political parties urging us to vote early, whether that's exactly legal or not, notwithstanding. And so that perception or that notion of that big crowd and the turnout and standing in line and all of that has helped put some juice behind proposals first to expand permitted vote by mail in Minnesota from the smallest of our townships to all of our townships. So there's some debate, do you permit it to everybody in the state? Do you permit it to small towns and townships, whatever? I think the two different bills have slightly different language. But in any case, townships who've chosen to go all vote by mail, and I actually believe that the entire western United States is just headed towards all vote by mail, because most of the states now, California is in the high 60s, Colorado's in the high 60s, Nevada's 70. I mean, western states have really gone to vote by mail. But in any case, here, 532 of our townships are in that tiny category and have had the permission, have chosen to go to all vote by mail. They're very happy. They also have clear data on increased turnout, reduced costs, and of course, the more we have strange weather, and that seems more often, the more there's a kind of insurance policy aspect to vote by mail, and so people are interested in expanding that opportunity, and I think that's one of the things that we will see in the packages that move forward. Another example is, the whole question of, kind of standing in line and all this. People kind of joke about this, but they say, look, I want to vote absentee, but I don't see the box to check as my excuse that my knees aren't as good as they used to be. Am I going to be out of the precinct? No. Are my knees bad? Yes. Where's the box for bad knees? It's not there. How come? Why do we have to have an excuse? Why do we make all the Lutherans lie? What's with this? No other state is really this crazy, right? So there's momentum for saying we don't have to have this excuse business with our absentee voting. And in fact, it's an insult to our people, and it also is the opposite of trying to understand what are the necessary dynamics of life and how we function. And you force people to put themselves into a box or a category, and it may not be like what they're, how they want to perceive themselves. So there is momentum to change that. At the same time, there's momentum to reduce the lines in some places, but also to provide a little more peace of mind for voters with what people see is everywhere else in the country but here, which is true early voting. I think it's 30-some states, maybe it's 38 or something, but they have not just walk-in, in-person absentee, which we have, and that's what the political parties mean when they send you out a postcard. I don't know how many of you got the one from the GOP saying, go vote early. They didn't really mean go vote early. They meant go absentee in-person vote. It's a nuance, but it's important in the law. But what they mean and what citizens many times want is what they see in the rest of the country, which is the ability to go in and not create all that paperwork and monkey business and possibly screw it up a little, but to go in, get their ballot, stick it in the machine. If it spits it back because you screwed up the circle, you get it fixed and you put it back in, you're done. Right now we have that form of early voting, if we want to use a not quite exact term, in our city hall, city clerk's office, typically county courthouse, the same public buildings that we have that act as polling places for our absentee voting purposes. The proposals are to make it so you don't have to fill in all the paperwork and all the paper and stick it in the thing and wait while the ballot board looks it over, and if you made a mistake, they've got to call you. You would get to fill in your ballot. If you are ready to vote, you walk up to the machine, stick it in, and if you haven't screwed up the circles, you're done. That kind of procedure in other states clearly does reduce, or in many cases, totally eliminate lines on Election Day. I mentioned Nevada because I'm working with Nevada closely on some poll book proposals, and I'm working with Alaska on some poll book proposals, and I was really surprised in Nevada, but they're down to 30% of their voting population voting on Election Day, and they just don't have lines. And so, you know, these things, there are multiple reasons for early voting, and for the local election official, who are my main constituency in a way, this eliminates the cost of absentee voting, the cost of tracking down people if they've screwed up their paperwork on the outside. That's about 5% of us. They eliminate the cost of the absentee ballot board, which has to be there with judges of opposite parties. They eliminate the cost of having to fuss around with all this unfolding and sticking it in, and if it's screwed up with the circles, he's kind of out of luck. And also, the current system concentrates absentee voting processing after 5 on the Friday before, and so the very time when you mostly are trying to set up your local polling places and get your machinery checked and all of that other stuff, you're having to fool around with all these absentee ballots when, in many cases, folks could just come in, fill in their ballot, vote as they would so choose, and eliminate the entire cost of that, and also the hassle and the line. So you begin to hear proposals being made that really do address questions of cost, even the question of recounts. The taxpayers pay for recounts that are within 0.5%. It's generally accepted that 0.25% is plenty safe, plenty conservative from the point of view of, you know, charging the taxpayers for something that's important to the whole community. And so there's a proposal to make it that we would not change the law. Anybody can get a recount on election if they want to, anybody under any circumstances, but they have to pay for it unless it's super close, in which case then the citizens, the taxpayers, pay for it. That's a kind of change. You'll hear a lot of other debates this time about questions about timing of primaries, about poll books, about things that have to do with what happens when somebody dies and they're on the ballot. There's a lot of other technical things as well that are being cleaned up. We have had quite a few years of not really tackling fundamental issues. We've been reacting to the recounts. The rest of the nation has continued to move ahead. Other states have online voter registration, and hopefully soon we will also. Other states have gone to early voting and that kind of thing. But also technology has moved ahead and demographics have moved ahead as we've not necessarily tackled these. So, you know, I'm really proud that we stayed #1 in election turnout last year, but I'm also aware that that's an average, and some parts of the states are high and some parts of the state are low. Some age groups are high, some age groups are low. We got we got a lot of data that tells us what we need to do to stay number one, but we also clearly, while quite high in our evaluations of our election administration, it's clear that there are things that we need to do, and it's not all in law, it's not all up to the legislature, but it is part of a broader discussion. So it should be an exciting year in the legislature, and I'm hopeful that we move things along, and it's been great to have the support from the council and others, pushing, but I think we need to, let the governor know and let the legislators know that your community is really in favor of not the status quo and moving forward to, make sure that we keep up with the new opportunities we have. So let's stop there.
Okay, great. I hope everybody's writing down your questions because we'll get to our question and answer period in just a moment. We've got one next speaker of our panel here, and that is Jim Dixon. He is via Skype, and he is going to be talking about Disability Vote Project on some of the national trends. Jim has over 30 years experience with nonpartisan voter engagement issues. He most recently was the vice president of the for organizing and civic engagement for the American Association of People with Disabilities, that is AAPD. He led AAPD's nonpartisan disability vote project, and that's a broad coalition of 36 national disability-related organizations whose mission is to close the political participation gap for people with disabilities. The project focuses on voter registration and education, get out the vote drives, election reform, and polling place access. Mr. Dixon played a central role with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights effort to pass the Help America Vote Act, as we all know as HAVA. He was part of the leadership team which passed the National Voter Registration Act as well. He is immediate past chair of the Board of Advisors to the United States Election Assistance Commission, and he's also a graduate of Brown University. So welcome, Jim. Please talk a little bit about some of the national trends that we're seeing here in voting.
Well, thank you, and hello, everybody. I'm assuming I can be heard. I sent in a PowerPoint.
Yep.
You've got that, Jim.
Okay.
We've got it.
Before we roll through the PowerPoint, I want to make 2 points. First, we have this notion that as Americans, we pick our political leaders. I think a way to think about election law in its worst sense is it's an attempt by political leaders to pick their people. It ought to be as easy to vote as it is to get a glass of water. But it is not, and that is not because the interests of all of our citizens are put above the interests of elected officials. It is that sometimes the election officials care more about their own re-election than they do about everybody voting. Are we at the first slide?
Yes, we are.
You got to remind me what's on it. I'm sorry.
Yep, the first one is discrimination, voters with disabilities not included in media polls.
This is very important. We know that in 2008, according to the U.S. Census, there were 14.7 million people with disabilities who voted. That's almost twice as many as Latino voters. But we are left out of the political discourse because we are not identified as a group in political polls conducted by the media or by candidates. That's flat out discrimination, and it hurts our ability to represent our constituency. It hurts our ability to influence state legislators, town and city councils, as well as the Congress of the United States. The National Council on Independent Living will be kicking off a national campaign to get the media to include us in public opinion polls, and we certainly would welcome the council and everybody else in Minnesota to help us come out of the back pages and be treated as equal citizens in public opinion. Next slide.
The census discriminates against people with disabilities.
I mentioned that in 2008 there were 14.7 million people with disabilities who voted. That comes from the Community Participation Survey of the United States Census. Tony Coelho, the immediate past chair of AAPD, led an effort. It took over 20 years to get us included in this community participation survey. However, and here comes the discrimination, the census releases that data in the spring or summer after a federal election. By that time, everybody's made up their mind who voted and who didn't. The media have picked the themes that they're going to cover and issues. Politicians know what constituencies they need to speak to and respond to. I can't give you the disability turnout for last year's election yet because the census has not released it. This is another factor in making us invisible to political leaders. Next slide.
That one is the 2008 and 2010 disability vote.
As you can see, our turnout numbers are actually pretty high. Though there is a problem embedded here. The disability community votes in very high numbers in presidential elections. Our voter participation in off years goes down. This hurts our constituency. This hurts our ability to advocate for change. Our voter participation in primaries is dismal. It's less than 15%. If somebody held a gun to my head and said, you can only vote in general elections or you can only vote in primary elections, my instant response would be, I will vote in primaries, because primaries are the elections that frame the debate. Primaries are where elected officials and would-be elected officials build a constituency, a coalition, to whom they expect to keep promises. Because our participation in primaries is dismal, we do not have elected officials coming to us saying, what do you want? With the exception of outstanding leaders like Secretary Ritchie. But we're always chasing elected officials. Next slide.
The next one is the Minnesota 2008 voter turnout.
Again, it was very good. You should feel very good about that. But again, it's the presidential general election. And by that time, the choices are narrowed. Next slide.
The 2010 Minnesota voter turnout.
You were not, as a community, we did not participate well in that off-year election. I don't want to sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but off-year elections, primary elections, and down-ticket voting have much more impact on the level of services that we get or do not get. Next slide.
This is the chart, the 2008 voter turnout among voters and eligible population.
First of all, I have to say that while Tony Coelho and others won that 20-year fight to get the census to identify us in the community participation survey, you never win everything you want or what's right. And so the community participation survey, we lost the question. We didn't get the questions asked the way we wanted to subdivide our community. The community participation survey uses different questions than the American community survey. But you'll see here that hard of hearing and deaf people vote best. People who have difficulty getting out of the houses, out of the home or around, vote least. As an aside, the Rutgers University conducted a poll right after the 2000 election comparing the voting experiences of people with disabilities with the able-bodied. This poll will be publicly released very shortly. 30% of people with disabilities who voted at polling places had a problem. 8% of the able-bodied who voted at polling places had a problem. So there still are issues with accessibility at the polling place. Next slide.
That one is the future of voting.
As Secretary Ritchie said, there is a clear movement across the country to go to absentee voting. 40% of people with disabilities vote absentee, though if you are blind as I am or have any number of other disabilities, mail-in or absentee voting takes away my right to a secret ballot. There are countries in Europe and Australia where people can vote by phone, by internet, in person, by mail. The fact that there is such a variety of ways for Europeans and Australians to vote is a factor in why they have higher voter turnout than we do. The means of voting is not the only factor, but it is a significant factor. Next slide.
This one is innovations in voting.
Honolulu has elections for local or neighborhood boards that control zoning. For the past 6 elections, those elections were conducted where one could vote only by telephone or internet. The turnout went up significantly, and the cost was reduced by 70%. Next slide.
That's the end.
I want to make two more points that I was not able to put into the slideshow. One of them comes from the Rutgers poll, which, by the way, was paid for with funds from the United States Election Assistance Commission. That poll, one of the questions they asked people with disabilities is, how would you prefer to vote in the future? Voting by telephone was the first choice. Voting by internet was the second choice. I want to reiterate the point that I began with, which is, if we are not included in the political polls conducted by the media, we will be continued to be put in a position where we often have to beg for what is right. The last point I want to announce is that AAPD and Bob Dole have announced the creation of an institute whose purpose is to train people with disabilities and our allies to run for public office. Our turnout numbers have improved immensely over the past decade, and there are now enough of us voting that if we focus on the primaries and leaders like yourselves will consider running for office, that will help hugely in improving the quality of life for America's largest minority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim. Before we jump into question and answers, I want to send out, because I know today with our snow day, we have a lot of people participating via our web stream. So here is the email address. You can start sending questions in. It's council.disability@state.mn.us. Again, that's council.disability@state.mn.us. And we'll start getting some questions coming in there. I think we'll go to one of our locations right now in Nicollet County, one of our council members there. Steve Grams is there. Steve, do you want to unmute your, since you're the only one there, do you have any questions or comments at this time for our speakers, Jeff, Secretary Ritchie, and Jim Dixon?
The question I have is directed towards Secretary Ritchie. Any changes in any changes in the voting process that goes on the state, does it always require legislative approval?
GW Connect is brought to you by the technology innovators at GW Micro.
You guys, that's Jim, and I will mute him right now.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Well, if it's a change in the law or change in regulations and rules which are derived from law, then it does require change in state law. The Supreme Court can and has invalidated state laws, basically said this is no longer applicable, and that can either leave a vacuum or it can be decisive in directing the legislature to change the law. And I mentioned earlier a district court judge decision that declared a section of the Minnesota Constitution related to election law as unconstitutional. And so that, again, is determinate in the sense that it is, a judicial ruling about a law. But there are lots of things that have to do with how elections are run that are local decisions at the township level, at the town, county, and at the state level that are important to keep in mind. So, for example, the courts have ruled now decisively and repeatedly that electronic signatures are valid legal signatures. That being said, then it's possible to design parts of our election system using electronic signatures in that way, and that's a kind of a technology-driven development that we're looking at right now. Our desire to make sure that there's broad agreement requires us to think about the legislature as one of our main partners, and there is a there's a natural difficulty in that an elected official, and I'll speak for myself, but I think this is true of all elected officials, we were elected under the current system. And so changes to that system we are immediately suspicious about from the point of view of how it might affect us personally. Hey, it worked for us. But secondly, the national climate of the last few years has made it clear that what Jim Dixon opened with, which is it appears that elected officials would like to pick the voters as opposed to the voters picking the picking the elected officials, has made it so that any proposed change creates a lot of nervousness. Well, who gets the partisan advantage? And so making sure that the legislature has a deep and broad role in changes in election law requires overcoming people's personal reticence about change, because all of a sudden the system that worked for them might be different, and it requires people to not say, oh, that gives me an advantage, that gives you an advantage, I don't want to do that. But I feel like it's sensitive, obviously election law is very sensitive grounds, and it's been fought over since the nation was founded. It was fought over in the Civil War. It was fought over in the Civil Rights. I mean, this whole process of changing the voting system has been sensitive from the very beginning, and it remains so today. I'm excited about the things that the legislature is considering, but I'm also excited about a lot of the ideas that I've heard from towns, townships, and counties. So I think this year probably will be a blend of some changes in law and also some local and county and state initiatives that are in the area of previously authorized but have not been implemented.
Now, you mentioned some of the things that are going through the legislature now. Could you address some of those?
So in both the House and the Senate, there are omnibus bills with quite a few different things. Some of them come out of very specific circumstances. I think you may remember that we had a city council president candidate who was on the ballot in Rochester who died right before the election, and there was quite a bit of chaos about what is the procedure, and this has triggered, I think there may be as many as 4 special elections that Rochester will have to pay for because of the way the law was written. So there's a bill to change what you do when somebody dies, or we call it a vacancy, in the case of a nonpartisan race. And at the same time, there was an unusual situation in Duluth when a partisan candidate came off the ballot and was replaced by the party. The Supreme Court ruled that Minnesota law, which controls a vacancy in a partisan race, was not allowed. And so those bills, those omnibus bills, contain provisions to change what we do in the case of a sudden or emergency vacancy, both in nonpartisan and partisan races. And those were agreed by a group of bipartisan legislators in both in the House and the Senate. So that, that's one of those sort of special circumstances that grew out of last year's election cycle that I think has a lot of momentum. A second issue that seems to be moving well is to reduce from 1/2 to 1/4% as the trigger for taxpayer-paid recounts. I think for local election officials who bear the burden of the cost and also the work this is an important thing, but of course, big recounts are rare, although we have had 3 recently. But I think it's an important thing in terms of giving some stability to the system. Proposal to expand all mail-in balloting among townships from the current 400 or fewer as a limit to any township that so chooses, I think is moving. Township Association is shepherding that. There have been proposals to make that apply to small towns. There's also proposals to make it apply to any unit. So I think there'll be something that'll happen in that area. The proposal to take away the requirement of an excuse to use the absentee voting process, I think there's been lots of public discussion about how bringing the law in line with reality, which is that people, just pick a box and check it because that's what they're required to do. That is not a very good way to kind of honor the voting system. I think there'll be change in that requirement. But both of those things also will push somewhat our election officials, and so the election officials, the county and city election officials, have been strong in their push for early voting 1 week or 2 weeks before the election. And those of us in cities where there were long lines, and in this case, Mankato and a couple of their precincts in the kind of core city area of Mankato, but our big cities as well, there's a strong push to do things to make sure that in big election years we don't get those kind of lines, and also to provide the peace of mind to some voters through early voting. That seems to be making some progress. Lots of debate around the timing of the primary, and that's one of those things that's odd because the primary is really the function of a political party, but the state has to kind of foot the bill, do some of the particulars, Office Secretary of State and local officials. And in that regard, the political parties view the timing of the primary as something with a, kind of has an effect on how the party functions. I think the National Republican Party today came out with a report wanting to have an earlier convention because they see that the timing of convention has an impact on the process. So that's in that category a little bit that Jim mentioned about, when the elected officials are determining the rules of elections, they're often thinking about things that aren't necessarily about maximizing the participation. Primary elections have moved from September to August to ensure that our military and others serving overseas have the time to get their ballot, get it back. That's been a huge success. I think our acceptance rate now of overseas ballots is, I think, was 99.4% or something like that last time, and for regular absentees, over 99%. So we've moved the primary to make sure our overseas voters have the ability to get their ballot back and all of that. So the desire to move it even earlier has more to do with the functioning of political parties, and that's a different kind of matter. But that's a discussion that's outside that omnibus bill. There's discussions about experimenting on a pilot basis with electronic poll books. Townships aren't interested in any more one-size-fits-all solutions, but they recognize that in some urban settings, suburban and urban settings, they have perhaps more money and can make use of capital investment in some technology that can then save clerical administrative costs on the backside of elections, and so there's a desire to see if experimenting with some of the new technology can make a difference. That's not necessarily settled out, but that's one of the things that that's also in discussion. There's a lot of cleanup of old language that's just, I would say, housekeeping type stuff, but that's some of the main things that you hear discussed when people talk about the omnibus bills.
Quick question, too. I know in a recent article in the paper they quoted the governor that he was not interested in signing any bill on elections, I think early voting, if there wasn't good bipartisan support. Do you feel like you've got some bipartisan support on some of the election bills that are moving through?
Yeah, well, I think the Township Association is a very bipartisan organization, and they're very strong about this. But I do think maybe the governor and everybody needs to have maybe a bigger conversation, because you just have to look at Washington and say, hey, you give one party a veto over what you can do, the nation kind of is the sufferer in that. So the notion that we need broad support, of course, is clear, and that was one of the real controversies last year. Is that typically in our 150 years, people have been pretty respectful of our Constitution. They haven't used it as a way to kind of manipulate things or to jam things through. But in recent years, we've been using the Constitution to, fix the roads and, improve fishing, and good Lord. And so there is some concern that particularly in the modern era, we're not taking into account, the full range of things that we might necessarily want to do. And of course, let's just take the issue of who pays for recounts. When you trigger statewide recounts, you are breaking the back of local election officials and the county officials who have to do it. And for the legislature, the governor, it has no meaning. They don't have to do any work. They don't have to hand out any money. It's just all on the local community, the election judges that get dragged in front of the court, and all the county auditors, and all the people have to count. And so when the governor and the legislature talk about these matters without taking into account that they're just, one part of the equation, they're not taking into account the citizens, the election judges, the election officials, and the people whose lives are affected, especially the taxpayers in the process. They can talk all day, but until we as the state say, hey, we had a big snowfall on Halloween just a few years ago. If you had a big snowfall on Election Day, who's going to get to the poll and who isn't? You're going to have big piles of snow at the bus stops. You're going to have big piles of snow at the corners. You're going to have big piles of snow in front of the polling places. Who's going to get to vote? So when the governor says everybody has to agree, that would imply that everybody has to take into account how it might be harder in a wheelchair walker to get to the polling place if there's a big snowfall. What should we do? What's the plan B? And so I feel like the community, folks who care about voting by everybody, and I think Jim opened with the right comment, needs to really be telling the legislature and the governor, get off it. We can see D.C., and we don't like dysfunction. What are you talking about? Where's the leadership? If this is a government that clearly needs leadership, where's the leadership in a statement like that? Where's the leadership from the governor? Where's the leadership from the leadership like that? I went around the state and held meetings with election judges and poll workers and local officials. They had fantastic ideas. They've been here testifying. They've been pushing. Not all the leadership can always have to come from the grassroots people and the folks who are busy with their lives. We need to see leadership. We need to see leadership in a significant way.
Good points. Good points. Trish, do we have one quick question maybe we can take from our online folks?
Yeah. So this one is for Jim. Jim, are you still with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So this one's for Jim. It's from Stuart in Stock Center, and he says, can you tell us where to get more info on the Rutgers poll report that you mentioned? And also, how do you think we can engage people with disabilities in off-presidential years?
The Rutgers poll will be online. If you search on the name Doug, D-O-U-G, Cruse, K-R-U-S-E. It will also be posted on the webpage for the Research Alliance for Accessible Voting. On the very important question, thank you, about more participation. I think there's 3 quick things. One, unfortunately there's a notion that since primaries can be partisan, a nonprofit cannot encourage its clients to vote in the primary, and that is just not accurate. The nonprofit cannot tell people for whom to vote or for which party to vote for or against, but I think nonprofits have a responsibility to explain to voters that the primaries matter, because the primaries are where promises to core groups are made. Primaries also give us a huge advantage. We're an organized constituency, and in low turnout elections like primaries, we can have a disproportionate impact. All we simply have to do is inform people that there are primaries and encourage them to vote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And you said we have one question here also for Jeff?
For Jeff, yeah. Jeff, what activities this is from Kathy in Horseshoe Lake in Minnesota. What activities is the Minnesota Council on Nonprofits and other groups doing to forward the early voting and other initiatives in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we're kind of a co-convener of the Voting Rights Coalition in Minnesota, which is a group of nonprofits and labor organizations working on policy reform and both proactive good things that we want to see and kind of defending the things that we want to preserve. So we've got a lot of great groups at the table, Disability Law Center, Courage Center, Goodwill Easter Seals, and the League, of course. So a lot of kind of grassroots work out there. It's been a challenge with, as Secretary Ritchie said, kind of with the call for bipartisan support to really move forward on this. We, in the Senate, for instance, where there's in the Senate Elections Committee, 3 of the Republican members there are all members who authored or previously authored, the voter ID amendment. They really philosophically have a very different take on where they want our election laws to go, and so it's hard to get things through some of those preliminary committees. But basically, what we're doing is trying to engage our constituencies, make a call for these changes. We know the polling supports it. This is really a political problem. It's not a public will problem. And we're just trying our best to bring that message to the Capitol. But it's not easy. We invite you to join us. I'd be happy to send you more information about ways to get involved.
Did you have any comments, Secretary Ritchie, on that?
It's calling every single one of your local officials, including your county auditor, your city or township clerk, and having them and yourself and your neighbors calling your senator and your representative and just say, this is what you want. There's an organized effort to, stop things from happening, not have them happen. You just have to express your point of view. It turns out that the local newspapers are really anxious to hear in letters to the editor and opinion pieces, people's point of view, and county auditor, city clerk is always interested to hear just from somebody, hey, I support what you guys do. And Township Association has been a strong voice for folks that live in townships, being affirming. Sometimes I think we forget to call and say, hey, I like what you're doing. We're quick to call and say, hey, I'm not happy about the water quality here. But I think we need to kind of get a little bit more on the positive affirmation.
If I could just jump onto that, coming off of this last fall where there was a lot of outrage from people on what was going on and then kind of a victory there, well, it's been a little harder to get people behind positive things. Sometimes people work more out of a sense of anger than a sense of, wanting to improve things. So we really need to work on that, I think.
Well, I think I'd like to move forward with our other 3 panels here. They're going to talk about their experiences in the last election. And it wasn't that long ago, 4 or 5 months ago here. I know it seems we have the election and then boom, it's gone, and then it seems like we forget about it. But So we want to talk to our other panelists here. We've got Roberta Blomster, and she's a self-advocate. We know her all well in our community. She's going to tell her story about voting.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Roberta Blomster. I'm a person under guardianship and also one of the 2 self-advocate mentors for Merrick Inc., with voter rights being one of my focus areas. And actually, I've been voting since, I became a legal age in the state, and it started out where my mom was helping me in the voting booth. But since 2005 or 2006, I've been actually voting with the AutoMark machine, and for me it goes a lot smoother that way, and that's how I voted, in the recent election in 2012. In 2005, I got involved with the voter rights bill that would even protect the right to vote for people under guardianship by mentioning in statute which group of people under guardianship who did not have the right to vote. This bill did become law. It was, in one of those big omnibus bills. For the 2012 and 2011 and 2012 legislative sessions, I was opposed to both voter ID legislation and the constitutional amendment, and also taking away the right to vote for everybody who was under guardianship. I did testify in 2011 twice, once in the House and once in the Senate, along with my mom, Anna Blomster, who is my legal limited guardian. I only testified in 2012 once, again in the Senate, on both issues. I'm thankful that the first issue did not make it into the state constitution, and that the second issue did not become law. If the voter ID constitutional amendment made it into the Minnesota Constitution, I could have lost my right to vote because of the clause in the state constitution, plain as can be, is a person under guardianship, was mentioned at the very top of it under the list of ineligible voters, and I believe that was the clause that Secretary of State Ritchie was referring to. I have been involved with Get Out the Vote efforts at Merrick in 2006 and 2012. With the second Get Out the Vote drive at Merrick, there were over 100 people who had attended it, as it was during our 3 on-site self-advocacy groups, Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday morning, and Thursday morning. There is an article in Access Press about the 2006 Get Out the Vote drive, which I brought copies of, so that you can read it. We also do voter packets at Merrick so that the clients/self-advocates are aware of the issues that are coming up in a big voting year, whether it's President of the U.S. or Governor of the state. Since Merrick is a 501c3 nonprofit, the staff cannot tell the clients/self-advocates who to vote for, and Merrick cannot take a position on constitutional amendments. I appeared in along with some other self-advocates from Merrick in the Go Vote video that the Disability Law Center had done, and it's a great video to check out. I was even on the planning committee for the disability community's first ever Secretary of State candidate forum that also happened in 2006, and I know Secretary of State Ritchie was there for that one. In fact, there were 2 rulings on the right to vote for people under guardianship that Secretary of State Ritchie also brought up. One by Judge Jonathan Frank in the summer of 2012, and the other one by Hennepin County Probate Court Judge Jay Quam in the fall of 2012. With Judge Quam's ruling, it was on the part in the Constitution, and he found out that the clause in the state constitution does violate the U.S. Constitution and declared the clause to be unconstitutional. I will be on a panel along with Pam Hoops from the Disability Law Center and Claire Wilson from the Secretary of State's office on Friday, April 26th from 2:20 p.m. to 3:20 p.m. The 3 of us are doing a voting rights presentation at the State Self-Advocacy Conference, which is on April 26th and 27th, titled, "We All Live in a Democracy, your voting rights as the Beatles would sing it. Are there any key challenges for me voting as a person with disabilities? I'm still keeping an eye out on bills that would take away the right to vote for everybody who's under guardianship and voter ID. I have not seen any bills on that yet, but who knows if that could change, as I will always remain opposed to those issues.
Thanks, Roberta. So it sounds like the AutoMark system really helps you remain as an independent voter.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, let's hear from our next speaker, Sigrid Johnson, election judge of Ramsey County and with the League of Women Voters in St. Paul.
Well, in preparation for today, I phoned the Ramsey County election office to see if there was any report from the evaluation meeting that head judges had after the last election. And there was no particular report. And I inquired about the measures taken for disabilities, because I understood that this would be focused today on disability. And Ramsey County has the AutoMarks in every poll. The polls are accessible either on grade or with an elevator. And they really didn't know of any, any considerations that should be changed. The judges didn't come up with any ideas, although Ramsey County routinely gathers the election judges to see what ideas or what considerations came up at the elections. I happen to be an election judge that was asked to assist in the recount after the 2008 election, and we very transparently and methodically went through every ballot. We turned them, every single one over, and even the attorneys for the losing party agreed that there was no fraud. We haven't discussed possibilities of fraud today, and that's probably for another meeting. But I really feel confident that at least the training and the accommodations for polls in Ramsey County are as accessible as they could be. What we did in my poll for the presidential election in 08 and in 12, we were in a elementary school, so the parking lot was empty at 7 in the morning, so that there was plenty parking until the teachers got there, and they were bumped to another parking spot. And it was right on the level where the poll was. The custodians were extremely helpful and provided chairs for people to sit and wait, because they came at 6:30, and that they had to wait was something they could have controlled themselves. But we had a long hallway from the poll to the cafeteria where everybody could line up. And my poll is a neighborhood local poll, and everybody had to chit-chat with their friends and neighbors while they waited. And then we had half of the gymnasium for the poll, and we were provided with yellow construction tape so that we could have a zigzag line and absorb quite a lot of voters in the poll. and they didn't have to line up outside. And lining up inside the school was warm and out of the weather. And I had a few new judges that had not judged in my poll, and they really were very complimentary, and they said, oh, this is really working very slick and very orderly. So
Okay.
that is extent of
Your
my
experience.
experience
Sure. Okay.
as a Ramsey County election judge.
Great. Okay. Our next speaker is Debbie McNeil, kind of representing senior citizens and also with the League of Women Voters in Edina.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I don't have any personal experience of voting as a senior that would impress anyone, but I'd like to take this opportunity to point out how the proposals now in the legislature for early voting and for no excuse absentee voting, which the Secretary of State has already referred to, would benefit seniors. It would make it easier for seniors to participate in the election process and would reduce barriers that we have because of being able to vote in person only on one day. So early voting basically would involve a period of time, maybe as proposed, about 2 weeks from 15 days before the election to 3 days before the election, when a person could, an eligible voter could go to their local election official's office and cast an in-person ballot. They could sign the roster and cast their ballot and feed it into the tabulator, although it would not be counted until Election Day. The ballot, as the Secretary of State has already said, would be rejected immediately if there's some invalidity to it, so it would be possible to correct that on the spot. So what does that do for our senior citizens? Well, the first thing is that it would not be necessary to wait in a long line on Election Day. And if the lines were till midnight or if a person had to wait for any length of time, that's a hardship on our right to vote. The second thing is that with having a number of days to vote, a senior could take into account the need for transportation. Maybe the ride that the person needs needs to be arranged, and maybe it's not possible to arrange it just on Election Day. So it would give you a 2-week period in which to work out something with your family or friends to take you to the polls. The second thing is that if health is a concern, that you'd have a window of time and you wouldn't have to be concerned about not being able to vote for health reasons just on Election Day. And of course, as the Secretary has pointed out, we all do remember the blizzard of 1991 on October 31st, so weather is a concern in Minnesota, and this would allow a window of time to vote on a day when the weather is favorable for voting. So all of these things would reduce barriers that are presented by having just a single day on which you can cast an in-person ballot. Also, clearly there's an interest in early voting in Minnesota because we see that people use in-person absentee voting as a way to vote early. But the two things are really not the same. In-person absentee voting involves a lot more expense. It costs more than twice as much, I understand, for election officials to process an absentee ballot as an in-person ballot. Also, you don't have the situation where the tabulator spits it out and you know if you've made an error and you can correct it right there. Also, you're supposed to have a reason, though that is, the reasons are in statute. They're limited to absence from the precinct, illness or disability, you're an election judge, the governor has declared an emergency, or you have a religious observance. But that makes absentee voting really inappropriate to use as early voting. We should have early voting as a separate standalone option, and we should also have no excuse absentee voting separately so that people do not need to fit into a particular box or check a box if it really doesn't fit them. It's important, I think, to enact both of those things because if we go with just no excuse absentee voting, it will become early voting even more so, and it will cost a great deal of money. People really looking for more flexibility, looking for an option that works for them. Seniors who want to cast their ballot in person will not be able to do that. People who cannot come to the polls on election day will be using absentee voting even more. People who want to avoid long lines will use it, and it will be very, very expensive. So I think that for seniors and anyone else who is looking for more flexibility in their exercising their right to vote, that early voting and no excuse absentee voting would be really good ideas.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that insight, I think, from the senior community on what might work and what might not work, to hear that. I think as we move forward here, we've still lucky enough to have Secretary Ritchie with us, and so I think we'll, again, open it up to our wonderful person who is in Nicollet County, Steve Graham's council member, to see if he's got any comments or questions.
Do you have someone in Blue Earth, too?
And then we'll go to Blue Earth after that.
I don't have any questions right now. There's something I'm trying to formulate, and I'll ask that question in just a few minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to go to Blue Earth?
Yeah, let's just go to Blue Earth then.
Do you have any questions in Blue Earth County?
You can unmute your phone or your remote. Nope, maybe no questions. I think online, Trish, you said we've gotten a
we
few.
did one, yeah. I wrote it down just because I think we might lose our computer here. Lutheran Social Services, this is more for election judges, but I think it could also apply to the Secretary of State. Lutheran Social Services supported over 130 people with disabilities to vote this past election, 8 of which would have been turned away if it wasn't for the training that they provided to staff and individuals on how to talk to election judges. Plus, it also helped that staff that they knew who to call if they had been denied. This is Nancy from Brainerd Lutheran Social Service, and she said she found that shocking, but mostly disheartening. Most people are unaware that some people with disabilities are denied their right to vote on a preconceived notion of intellectual acuity based on appearance and language. Maybe would the election judges here or the Secretary support a training for election judges by a variety of people with disabilities, and do they think that that might be more helpful in those areas?
You have thoughts, Ingrid, at all on
Could I
that?
speak to Ramsey County? My poll had 2 judges who were young men and were Somali interpreters, and they were wonderful. And for people who don't speak English, speaking English is not a necessity to voting. And the 2 interpreters were a great help.
Well, I think the writer, the question proposer, is putting her finger on something that's not just important from the immediate, but in the near future. It's 1 in 80 of our young people are born somewhere on the autism spectrum or with Down syndrome, and they will be voters at age 18. And all of us are getting older, and how we handle all the aspects of aging is a complicated matter. And it turns out that election judges are the front line, and there's a lot of law and other things behind it. What we've clarified is that unless a judge has taken away the right to vote, the minute you turn 18 and until they lay you in the ground, you're a voter. And so how we then sort of make sure that's the truth and that's how the world works requires bringing a different kind of understanding to our polling places. And for the moment, we are just blessed to have Lutheran Social Services and the Council of Nonprofit and the League of Women Voters and the other organizations to be advocates and to be, providing, I'm assuming, transportation. But the suggestion made by the writer about a special training, and of course we have 30,000 election judges, so this is a little complicated from a logistics point of view, but adding to the video or creating a second video that very specifically deals with a delicate subject, a sensitive subject, but says, as an election judge, unless somebody's right to vote has been taken away by a judge, they have a right to vote. We also have laws that very directly protect. A guardian cannot influence a person's vote, and but I'm taking from this suggestion the notion that in our training videos and at sessions where we are sort of training the trainers, so that's kind of the county election official, typically the auditor, has responsibility for training the clerks who then have it's kind of a tiered thing. To think about a more subconscious way to interpret that information to people. For example, Judge Quam's ruling is quite dramatic, and I don't think it's gotten much discussion out there, but it's well done. Judge Donovan's ruling. But I will go back and talk with Claire and with Beth and the people who ultimately will have that responsibility and say, we need to be building into the training, however we do that, the video, the in-person sessions, all of that, a kind of another module that takes this into account. I also think it's fair to say that there is no alternative to eternal vigilance. I mean, every polling place, every election judge, every person in the hallway, the challengers we're not in control of. There are just all kinds of things that go on in this human activity. And so we need to be doing everything we can to reinforce that elections, if your core mission as a nonprofit is housing or social services or adoptions or whatever it is, that elections and participation is at the heart. And I thought Jim's comment about being able to establish in the minds of everybody running for office the importance, this is our eternal task. And so the better we do at training our judges, the less often. But those 8 that were in particular raised in this comment, the specifics of those circumstances need to be reported in a video so that somebody can say, look, generally speaking, we're able to work this out, but here were 8 really tough situations, and election judges be on alert, and having that backup phone number and having those, backup services. I mean, we face a much larger sort of chaos situation with our people who've been convicted of felonies who haven't had their civil rights restored. It is almost impossible to figure out who to call to really make a real determination. But in any case, while we have a great system, clearly these are areas where improvement is needed, and training our election judges to be both appropriate, but also to know what the rules are, and also to know who to call to get proper information. I'm going to bring that back to our office and really appreciate the question. I feel like this is a 10-year discussion that we need to be having, because as a society we are transforming very rapidly. And I speak with parents now at Autism Society meetings and other meetings, and I say, hey, some of you react to me and say, that's impossible, my kid will never vote. And some of you react to me like, oh, I never thought about that. And so clearly, parents of our young are not yet engaging in that conversation, and then all of a sudden their loved one is 18 years old. It'd be good to get parents thinking about this in addition to election judges, of course, but also in addition to the whole society, and so that we are paying attention to who we are demographically. And I want to make sure that while I am in office, that this topic gets lifted into a different priority.
Sure, the education component really needs to be.
And there's policy, and there's a lot of, Jim mentioned the question about voting by mail as something that can have limits.
Sure.
And of course, that's why you have polling places at the town, that kind of thing. A lot of ideas sound good, voting by phone, but hey, if you ever had to recount an election, you don't want a bunch of phone bills and brought to say, oh, look, I voted. You know what I mean? Right. I mean, you got to think big about what these changes are, and then imagine all of the aspects, and then you've got to say, okay, within our world, this is what we're going to do. And less that Lutheran social services and all the, Catholic relief and everybody who makes a difference. implies a different understanding of empowerment fundamentally.
Trish, you said we do have one last online question.
Yep. This was for all the panelists. This is from Doug in Lino Lakes. How are you currently involved in expanding voting options?
Who's that addressed to?
It was addressed to all the panelists, yeah.
The League of Women Voters has candidate forums, and one of the things that inhibit people from voting is that, well, I don't know who to vote for. So we provide public forums for them to meet candidates and to question candidates. And we also publish a voter guide that has the background and answers to 5 questions, usually on policy issues.
I would add to that, also being a League of Women Voters member, that the League of Women Voters is a member of the Voting Rights Coalition, which supports early voting in Minnesota, which I talked about, which would expand voting options, and it supports no excuse absentee voting. And both of those changes, if made to our practice, would expand options and make the possibility for more participation. I would say that, you know, there are 32 states that already offer early voting, and so our residents in Minnesota could benefit from having that option as well.
Roberta, did you want to say something?
Well, I think the big thing with Merrick is obviously the get out the vote drives. I mean, last year was working with Claire from the Secretary of State's office, and I mean, we even had some clients at Merrick that voted for the first time last year. I mean, it was huge just to hear about that. So that's always been the big thing, is the get out the vote drives.
So you think they're successful and we should continue to do them?
Absolutely.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. One last time to go. I don't know if Steve, since you're a wonderful person who's actually in a location, did you have any comments or thoughts before we leave here today?
Well, I have one question to Secretary Ritchie. You know, it's really a crime in our country that we have such a low turnout. And for countries that don't have the right to vote, when they finally do, they have massive turnout. How can we change the apathy that exists in our country and also the state to increase the number of people to get and exercise their right to vote?
Well, that's a great question to maybe close out, but let me first say that Minnesota in presidential years votes as high as almost any other country on the planet. And the parts of our state that vote in the 90% range, which actually is a lot of parts of our state, are voting way above, you know, anything around the planet. So, you know, I feel like some of our citizens, some of our regions, some of our states are voting up there. But I'm the kind of person who says, okay, that's an average, and an average means there's below and above. What can we do to bring it all up? And we identify 3 things that I think are universal concerns, whether you're in Hawaii, where they only have 44% turnout, or Minnesota, where we're in the high 70s. But the first one is that our young people and our new people who arrive in our states or in our country need the information about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. It's just kind of basic information, and there have been cutbacks of all kinds in the sort of budgets of groups and agencies that are there to educate and inform. So that's a challenge. So that's just information. The second thing is that there's a necessity to make sure that people know they are welcome. I specifically am thinking about our 18-year-olds, having raised a teenager, they are unbelievably shy about something new. They're very reticent about something where they might screw it up somehow. And the notion of the sort of adult society and whatever, that there are elements of welcoming and encouraging that are just super important. And some schools are bringing in voting machines for the homecoming queen and king voting so people can vote. At our fair booth, young people come and vote, and then they say, oh, that was easy. And it's a trigger for me to remember that they thought somehow it was hard and complicated. So that's a second thing, which is welcoming. But a third thing is that a significant number of people have come to a conclusion somewhere in their life that they're not going to vote, or they're cynical about voting, or they think voting doesn't matter. It might be, I'm just one person, or it might be, oh, I put my faith in this individual that got elected, then they compromised, or something happened. And I think that to the extent that we have a certain number of our citizens who have that belief, and keep in mind in Minnesota there were 1 million people that didn't vote in our state. We're a little state with the highest voting in the nation that's well organized, and we had 1 million. Some portion, I find that reminding people in subtle and not subtle ways about the sacrifices made to create the nation, to decide on a democracy as opposed to some other form of monarchy or some other system, to then fight and die for the right to vote, to expand the right to vote from a few landowners to other men, to women, to Native Americans, to African Americans, to people with disabilities, that if you can touch on the underlying elements of our heritage, our history, our culture, our values, things like our Vote in Honor of Veteran program and stuff like that, people will stop for a second. They'll get past whatever is in their minds that says, oh, I'm not going to vote, my vote won't matter, oh, I'm not going to vote because all politicians are the same. They will then say, oh, wait a minute, we're all in this together, somebody died for my right to vote, I need to be part of this process. If I don't vote, I can't complain. You know, there are all kinds of little shorthands we have. So my sense is that whether it's trying to narrow the gap among different geographies or age groups, or whatever it is we're trying to do, that if we are making sure that people know how to vote and they feel very welcome to come in and vote, and we are continuing to do our civic education, our civic engagement, our civic communication to teach history and government and all of those things in our school and in our adult lives, that we will slowly but surely narrow the gap. I happen to know that for some people, but especially young people, there are still barriers that we have to tear down. And of course, as we age, there are increasing barriers that face us as we age as well. So tearing down barriers is, of course, really crucial to continuing to expand the percent who vote. But beyond the tearing down barriers, I do think that there are public policies to inform, to welcome, and then to remind people of how we got this right to vote and our responsibilities in carrying that on into the future, that are the tasks that showed up in this room and that showed up on the internet and in Nicollet County and other places. We share that sort of value to do that together, and we're constantly trying to find ways to continue to do that, you know, by inspiring people and by welcoming people and by putting our arms around people, especially our kids, and saying, come on.
Bring us some great points. Absolutely, really good points. Stephen, anything else before we wind up?
Well, I know that here in Nicollet County, the young vote can really sway an election. Now, and it really, you know, I often wonder myself, does my single vote really matter? And I can, you know, in 2008, I think we all found in the recount that a single vote really does matter. And in this particular county, when a candidate wants to get elected, they really do cater to the young population in our colleges, in particular Gustavus, and in Blue Earth County, you've got Mankato State, Bethany, and South Central. So the young vote really does matter, and it really can sway an election. And when I lived in northern Minnesota, there were 28 eligible voters, and there were election judges that sat there all day. And it's amazing the amount of time, energy, and money that is spent for those 28 eligible voters.
Yeah.
And that's how much it does matter in our state. It really, truly does.
Amen.
Yep, I know. We're all kind of chuckling here. So, well, thanks, Stephen, for getting out. You guys probably got more snow where you're at maybe than the rest of us, but anyway, thanks for participating. I think we'll wrap things up here. This has been, despite our snow that's kind of impacted some of the people from attending today, I know we had a lot more online, so we will be sending out evaluations to everybody who participated. We always like to hear how we've done. But we want to thank our speaker, Mark Ritchie, for being here, and our other speakers here as well, and Jim Dixon, who was Skyped, and he left a little bit ago. And so we appreciate everybody's thoughts and insights on this, and, voting. It's a right, and we have to remember that. And I think about engaging younger people, I think, is huge. And so we've got to really work hard on talking with everybody about it. So thanks, everyone, for attending. Now, we will have this archived up on our website in a few days, and you can go to disability.state.mn if you want to see yourself on camera, or and forward it on to others. And we'll have to link somehow with the Secretary of State's office so you can utilize this throughout the year as well. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks so
Nice
much.
to see you.
Yes,
Yeah.
great.